After 9 months of phony war, Operation Rolling Thunder started on March 2nd, 1965. Huge US strikes rocked North Vietnam, targeting critical infrastructure. A month later, on April 4th, a strike package of 48 F-105s and 8 F-100s set off to attack the Dragon's Jaw Bridge in the centre of North Vietnam. To get the correct spacing over the target, the second and third waves of Thuds were forced to orbit in hazy skies at 15,000 feet, laden with 500-pound bombs and drop tanks. Amongst these aircraft was Zinc Flight of 4 F-105Ds from the 354th Tactical Fighter Squadron at Korat. Because of their heavy bomb load, they began to circle at 325 knots to save fuel. As they came to the first orbit point, Zinc 3 saw 2 aircraft in a shallow dive behind Zinc 1 and Zinc 2, piloted by Major Frank Bennett and Captain James Magnuson. But he initially couldn't identify them. They were MiG-17s. They rocketed over Zinc 3 and 4 and opened fire on Bennett and Magnuson with their heavy cannons. Zinc 1 took heavy damage but kept flying. Zinc 2's aircraft immediately burst into flames and crashed to the south of Tran Hoa. As Zinc 3 watched in horror, he realised that 2 other MiGs were lining up on him. The 2 F-105s jettisoned their stores and turned to attack, but the MiGs were too fast and disappeared into the haze. Major Bennett managed to turn his cripple fighter and headed for Da Nang. 10 miles out, the F-105 stopped responding to his control inputs and he said he was going to eject. Sadly, his parachute didn't open properly and he was killed. Major Bennett and Captain Magnuson were the first air-to-air losses the USAF suffered in the Vietnam War. Over the previous month there had been several near misses and it was quickly becoming apparent to US planners that the MiG-17 might be obsolete, but in combination with good Vietnamese ground controllers and restrictive US rules of engagement, it could be dangerous. These same planners had assumed that the subsonic, radarless MiG would be as ineffectual against the F-100 and F-4 as they believed the MiG-15 had been against the F-86 Sabre in Korea a decade earlier. But the early evidence was that if the MiG could get close enough to the big, powerful US fighters in a knife fight, then it was worryingly effective. More analysis was needed to understand what pilots should be doing and not doing in order to counter this threat. The immediate trouble was that the US had yet to get its hands on a real MiG-17. They needed a stand-in, so they turned to the same aircraft that had defeated the MiG's predecessor in Korea, the F-86 Sabre. So in late April and early May 1965, Air National Guard Sabres flew simulated engagements with every fighter in the Tactical Air Command's inventory. They then extended the project with a second tranche of tests later that summer. Some of the lessons were taken to heart and doubtless saved American lives in Southeast Asia. Some were not and demonstrably led to pilots being killed or captured. They called this project Featherduster. Before we go through the lessons of Featherduster, let's meet the cast of characters. First, the antagonist. There are many types of sabres with all sorts of capabilities. The F-86H is one of the last of the line. It was originally conceived as a strike fighter, and because it was the 1950s, that meant being able to deliver a nuclear bomb. Even so, it remained a capable dogfighter. The F-86H flight handbook contains this convenient table that explains the major differences between the H and its predecessors. Of particular interest is the new J-73 engine, with 9,400 pounds of thrust, a significant hike upwards on the 5,500 pound J-47-33 on the preceding F-86F. The H therefore has a substantially greater thrust-to-weight ratio than earlier models, making it more able to sustain speed in high G turns and giving it excellent acceleration when clean. One remark I'd like to make at this point is that the Sabre was chosen for its general resemblance to the MiG-17. This is quite kind to the MiG in my view. The Sabre is a real beauty. The MiG looks like it was built more for carrying. That isn't to say the MiG should be underestimated, just that its designers took a more agricultural approach to things. Arrayed against the diminutive Sabre were the 4 main US tactical fighters of 1965. The F-100 Super Sabre, the F-4C Phantom II, the F-104C Starfighter, and the F-105D Thunder Chief. These were all physically much larger than the F-86, as you can see from this picture. Increased size translated into significantly increased weight. The F-105D is about 3 times the weight of a Sabre, and F-4 is not far behind. For this reason, all of the more modern fighters had greatly higher wing loadings than the Sabre, meaning that all things being equal, the Sabre would be able to turn more tightly. The F-104 and F-4 were at least able to counter this agility with greatly increased thrust-to-weight ratio, giving them increased ability to sustain high G turns and to employ vertical maneuvers. All of these aircraft could be armed with air-to-air missiles, and indeed the test assumed that they were carrying AIM-9B sidewinders in addition to whatever internal guns they had. That meant that the Sabre was armed with 650 caliber machine guns, the F-100 with its 4 20mm cannons, the F-104 and F-105 both have M61 Vulcan 20mm Gatling guns, and the F-4C of course famously had no internal gun, but some runs in this test were done with a simulated gun pod. It could also carry the AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missile. It's worth noting that in reality the F-105 didn't carry the Sidewinder, as the pylon that was available at this stage was rather high drag and therefore impacted the F-105's speed. Since speed was the F-105's primary defense, pilots and commanders chose to operate with the gun as their only dogfighting weapon. The final point to make before we talk about the in-period conclusions is that the F-86 pilots came from the New York, Maryland and Puerto Rico Air National Guards. Each of the tests was 45 minutes long and was flown to a script in which the attacker and defender started from particular positions and with particular plans in mind. It wasn't a complete free-for-all. The Sabre acted both as an attacker and a defender, and the tests were conducted as one-on-one, one-on-two, and two-on-two engagements. I think it's most instructive to first understand the conclusions from the F-86 pilot's point of view, as it informs us about how the VPAF pilots and ground controllers might have set their tactics after the initial engagements. In general, so long as the F-86 pilots were aware of the presence of the larger fighters, essentially a given because of their large size and smoky engines, then they would be able to defeat an initial AIM-9B attack from astern by turning sharply into the attack and thus exceeding the missile's lambda limit. The F-104 had a clear advantage in this respect, as its very small profile made it hard to spot as it approached. The supersonic slashing attack by the F-104 was thus hard to defeat. After defending from the follow-up gun attack from within 3,000 feet, the Sabre was able to defeat any of the TAC fighters in a turning fight. With their higher thrust-to-weight ratios, the F-4 and F-104 would be able to escape if they were carrying 0.9 Mach or greater, otherwise the Sabre stood a good chance of getting a gun kill as they extended out. Only the F-100 stood any chance in the turning fight, and only then if flown by an air combat maneuvering instructor pilots, as the F-100's potentially dangerous adverse yaw could be turned into a turning advantage at low speeds by a very experienced pilot. Both the F-100 and F-105 were able to force the F-86 to overshoot at times using their speed brakes. Unfortunately, rapid deceleration against an alert F-86 simply prolonged the inevitable, as neither type had the acceleration to get back into an advantageous energy state, as the F-86 employed a high yo-yo to re-establish firing position. The F-104 and F-4 just couldn't employ deceleration maneuvers effectively at all. In short, despite its obsolescence, once past the merge, the slightly shocking conclusion for the Tactical Air Command observers was that a well-flown F-86 was more than a match for any of the current crop of US tactical fighters. Unless the F-4 could pop it in the face with an AIM-7, even the USAF's premier air superiority fighter would find itself on the defensive in the early part of the engagement. Flipping sides, the F-104 community had the most confidence to take from Featherduster. Unless they were drawn into a horizontal turning fight, their aircraft was able to consistently defeat the Sabre when on the attack, and extend out of combat if on the defensive. The Starfighter's performance advantage meant that it also had the option of deliberately running the Sabre low on fuel by extending the engagement. Hit and run was by far the safest option for the F-104 on the attack, as if their speed dropped, for example through a vertical maneuver intended to re-engage after a failed initial pass, the F-86 would be on them before they could regain the energy advantage. The F-4 had a tighter window in which it could successfully defend a well-flown Sabre. Due to the Phantom's massive thrust advantage, an ambush at speed and altitude was relatively easy to defend, as the F-4 would be gone before the Sabre could position effectively. Escape was also possible at medium altitudes and speeds around 0.78 Mach, provided the F-4 immediately jettisoned external stores and went to full afterburner as the attack commenced. Under no circumstances was the F-4 to attempt to slow and turn with the F-86. To do so always resulted in the Sabre rapidly achieving a position for a gun attack. The F-4 pilots assessed the chances of getting into position for a gun's kill against a well-flown F-86 as extremely small unless the latter pilot didn't spot the Phantom until it was too late. If spotted, an alert Sabre pilot would break back into the attack and thus increase off-angle so much that the Phantom couldn't get enough lead to score a kill. Given the Sabre's excellent visibility, opportunities for an ambush didn't occur in the tests. Conversely, relatively poor rearward visibility was a challenge for the Phantom in spotting the smaller Sabre. An important note is that these findings meant that some TAC wings decided that their aviators would be better off not carrying a gun pod, as it encouraged their pilots to slow down into a flight regime in which the MiG-17 was advantaged, better to encourage them to separate and use their missiles. In summary, the advice to Phantom pilots was that it was pointless to try and turn with the Sabre. Instead, they should ignore this temptation, extend and re-attack on their own terms. The Phantom pilots also cautioned that the AIM-9B was severely limited against hard manoeuvring targets, as was the AIM-7 unless rules of engagement changed to enable it to be used before the merge. The advice to F-105 pilots was essentially to run away as soon as possible rather than mix it with the Sabre. Speed needed to be kept high. It's notable that the tactical demands that Zinc Flight faced made this impossible on April 4th. Mach 0.9 or higher was recommended for safety as it allowed defensive employment of hard turns to foil AIM-9B or gun attacks. Following the initial break, the recommendation was that F-105 pilots employed a descending spiral and afterburner to separate. High G rolls and scissors were unsurprisingly not recommended, as the initial benefit in forcing an overshoot rapidly became a lethal disadvantage due to loss of energy. Finally, on the attack, the F-105 pilots were advised to keep speed about 1.2 Mach or higher and make a single pass. The advice to F-100D pilots was essentially the same. Outside of the advice for individual aviators, Featherduster's authors made 6 recommendations for TAC. First, tactical fighter aircrews should be provided the information in the report as soon as possible. This was done, but largely for information rather than as a formal instruction. Second, TAC fighter units should use formations that emphasize good lookout capability and mutual coverage due to the importance of detecting MiG-17 attacks at sufficient distance to gain separation and then re-engage at higher Mach. This is a really important point that would lead to the loss of US aviators. The standard tactical formation at the time was the fighting wing that had been successfully employed in Korea. Senior pilots as flight and element leads did the shooting, while junior pilots essentially existed to protect the leader's six rather than to attack themselves. This latter doctrine meant that the wingman was occupying a position in which they would be shot down rather than the leader if the element came under attack. The leader was not in a position to look out for the wingman, as they would be concentrating on shooting at their target. Against the VPAF, whose pilots were individually directed by ground control into favourable positions, this doctrine was very hazardous for the wingmen. Notably, the Starfighter squadron that did so well in Featherduster were from the 435th Tactical Fighter Squadron. This squadron were leaders in developing and employing fluid attack and double attack tactics, in which the lead and the wingman operated as a mutually supporting team rather than having the wingman bolted to the leader's wingtip. The intention of such tactics was to position the wingman's aircraft to deny their opponent the opportunity to counter and to take advantage of evasive manoeuvres which were forced by the leader. Unfortunately, the fighting wing was firmly entrenched as a tactical fighter formation. Commanders believed that it carried less risk of collisions during manoeuvring and that pilots should spend hundreds of hours mastering it before considering more radical tactics. TAC used it all the way through to 1972. Third, fighter pilots and commanders shouldn't take away from the evaluation that air combat manoeuvring was now obsolete. The conclusions that accelerating separation manoeuvres offered the best course of action was only going to be valid against Mach-limited enemy fighters. Such manoeuvres wouldn't be possible if TAC fighters were attacked by the MiG-21, and a resort to defensive manoeuvres that forced an overshoot would then be necessary. At the end of Rolling Thunder, the MiG-21 would starkly demonstrate this fact by matching and then flipping around the kill ratio USAF pilots achieved against it. Fourth, to increase proficiency in flying widely spaced tactical formations, the use in training of route formation should be minimised and maximum use be made of tactical formations. Similarly to the enforcement of fighting wing as the default tactical formation, route formation essentially existed to make orderly, neat-looking transits. The technocratic, nuclear-obsessed Air Force that emerged in the 1950s liked things to be neat and orderly. Unfortunately, combat is not like that. The VPAF refused to play by the book and loved to ambush flights in route formation. Fifth, realistic wing-level air combat tactics training programs should be conducted to include flying clean aircraft and to include minimum restriction on manoeuvring other than the flight handbook limitations. The F4 crews were the most scathing in this regard. To quote their team's assessment, the almost complete lack of a vigorous ACM program throughout the Air Force severely limits our potential. ACM takes practice and judgment. Proficiency cannot be achieved by reading manuals and theorizing. The risks inherent in maximum performance maneuvering can be minimized by education and supervision. Unrealistic limitations would defeat the fundamental purpose. Given that as a rank amateur I'm making videos about air combat theory, I take that statement as a dig. In seriousness, though, lack of realistic training meant that pilots didn't have the instincts they needed when they were unexpectedly attacked. They also risked falling into a common trap. If you always practice maneuvers against an identical aircraft, you risk believing that the winner in a dogfight is the person who can control the aircraft at the lowest speed in a horizontal turning fight. Fighting the Sabre demonstrated the suicidal nature of this tactic. Finally, the authors also recommended that future air superiority aircraft procurement programs focused on designs capable of maintaining a high energy state. This, I believe, is a piece of propaganda inserted by Boyd and the fighter mafia, but it did prove to be correct in the end. Although prescient, Featherduster did have some weaknesses. The F-86H was a stand-in for the MiG-17, and it would be 3 years before the US would get their hands on a real MiG to test. Although by no means a bad stand-in, the F-86H and the MiG-17 had some differences that consequently made a difference to the tactics the VPAF pilots could actually employ. For example, the MiG-17F didn't carry the AA-2 atoll, which meant that it had to commence attacks from much closer in than assumed in Featherduster. Perhaps more significant was the difference in gun armament between the types. As I said earlier, the F-86H was armed with 6 50-caliber machine guns. This setup was considered markedly superior to the two 23mm and one 37mm cannon on the MiG-17, which was more optimised for bomber interception. It is certainly true that low shell velocity and slow rate of fire reduced the effectiveness of the MiG's cannons against a manoeuvring target, but they did come with some benefits. First was range. Whereas the 50 calibers were set to converge at 1,000 feet, the big cannons could be effective as far out as 5,000 feet, which, given the small visual signature of the MiG, was close to the maximum range at which a US pilot could positively identify it as an enemy. Furthermore, the heavy rounds increased the chance of a golden BB strike that would down a US aircraft. This was particularly troublesome for the F-105, which had vulnerabilities in its hydraulic system that made it sensitive to battle damage. The MiG-17 as a platform also had some weaknesses in comparison to the Sabre. Although an improvement over the MiG-15, it bore uncured aerodynamic quirks that made it unstable and unpredictable in higher speed flight regimes. Its flight controls remained heavy, and it had poor rear visibility compared to the Sabre. Manoeuvres, particularly diving manoeuvres, that were possible in the Sabre would be hazardous or suicidal in the MiG. This brings me to my final point of note: the quality of pilots involved in Featherduster. The Air National Guard pilots were well-trained and experienced aviators. They were very aggressive, and they looked to mix it with the TAC flyers at every opportunity. Although it is true that some North Vietnamese flyers proved to have excellent skills, and all VPAF flyers demonstrated great bravery in taking on the USAF, for the most part TAC's reports were that Vietnamese pilots were not aggressive and had relatively poor ACM skills. Excellent ground control made up for this for some degree, with the upshot that MiG-17 pilots generally shied away from any engagement in which they could not ambush the US formation and then escape after a single pass. The lessons of Featherduster were not taken to heart as much as they could have been. From my vantage point, the pre-war doctrine and accepted wisdom of the USAF appears to have made them unwilling to alter their approach when faced with an opponent that did not conform to their ideas of how an air war should be fought. If TAC had taken its own officers' advice and engaged in a crash program of dissimilar ACM training, perhaps using Sabres and F5s, which were both plentiful, then they would have created a gross superiority of capability between US and VPAF flyers. Aggressive tactics work well for both sides, but were sporadically deployed. Encouraging squadrons to experiment with less rigid tactical formations would also have helped. Putting pilots in harm's way is the difficult job of a strategic commander. But by optimizing tactics to reduce accidents, and by having an excessively high opinion of the inherent skills of US aviators and US technology, senior leadership amplified the risks for their people. And as pilot attrition and the 100 mission rule began to chew away at tactical aircrew skills and experience, the potential for unnecessary casualties grew by the year. I hope you found this video interesting and useful. My intention was to increase understanding of what US leadership and US tactical aviators knew or could anticipate about air-to-air fighting in Vietnam before the major battles got underway. I hope this video has achieved that objective. If you have any thoughts or comments about this subject, then I'd love to hear them in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching.